Welcome to Moving Forward, conversations on culture, identity, healing, and hope. I'm your host, Linda Anderson, and I created this podcast as a space for real, heartfelt conversations with people who are reflecting, evolving, and boldly stepping into what's next. This podcast was born out of my own journey through seasons of loss, transition, and transformation, and my belief that healing happens when we come together to share our stories. My hope is that these conversations will inspire you to pause, reflect, and find courage as you move forward in your own life. Today, we're joined by historian and award-winning author Ann Bausum to talk about her powerful new book, White Lies: How the South Lost the Civil War, then Rewrote the History. The book has already received 7-starred reviews, with Kirkus calling it essential reading. It exposes the most successful propaganda campaign in American history, the Lost Cause narrative. The campaign reframed the Confederacy defeat, distorted textbooks for generations, and still fuels divisions today. Ann grew up in Lexington, Virginia, surrounded by monuments and cultural messages that glorified the Confederacy. Decades later, she had meticulously unmasked the lies that shaped her childhood and continue to shape our national debates over monuments, education, and identity. Written for teens but vital for everyone, White Lies invites us to confront the myths we've inherited and to ask how truth can move us forward. Ann, I am so honored, and welcome to this podcast.
Linda, it's really a privilege to be here as you kick off this new adventure and are sharing yet again with others. Thank you for including me.
Absolutely. So, Ann, you grew up in Lexington, Virginia. You were immersed in the lost cause narrative. But how did those early experiences shape your decision to write this book?
So it was really a lifelong journey to get to the realization that I needed to write this book. As you noted, I grew up in Lexington, Virginia. For anyone who knows their Civil War history or has traveled, you'll know that that's Confederate commemoration, or at least it was when I was growing up in the 1960s. And I was raised on lost cause inspired textbooks of Virginia state history that I just took at face value, because that tends to be what we do, especially when we're in 4th grade or 7th grade. We're young, we trust the process. And it was not until I left the South, moved to Wisconsin, went to college, Beloit College, began to talk to people from other parts of the country and travel more extensively, that I came to realize that my understanding of the Civil War didn't always align with the understanding that people from other parts of the country brought to that history. And so I filed that away. And then some years later, after I had become a parent and decided to take my writing skills and apply them to writing books, primarily for children and teens about history, and began researching history in greater depth as an adult, that caused further understanding of the fact that there'd been a mismatch in what I had been taught, and what I was discovering was a more accurate representation of the historical record. And furthermore, because I took an interest in writing about the civil rights movement, which aligned very much with my background as a white child growing up in the segregated South, and then having our schools become integrated, and being cognizant of the history that was unfolding all around me, even as a child, and how remarkable it was. It's not surprising that I was drawn to write about that period as an adult. And the first book I wrote on the civil rights movement was about the Freedom Rides. And that trip, I really felt, to be able to write that book, I needed to take a trip through the South as an adult. I'd not done a road trip in the South as an adult. And and went through, retraced the routes of the Freedom Rides and stopped off in Troy, Alabama, which is the hometown for John Lewis, the late congressman, who was a Freedom Rider. And in the middle of the town square in this tiny little town was a Confederate statue. And that was another sort of light on the way station for me of there's something going on here. I didn't realize there was Confederate commemoration beyond Lexington and or maybe Richmond. I knew about that. And so beginning to travel through the South for that book and then traveling even more extensively for one I did on the March Against Fear and discovering that every little town in Mississippi that the March Against Fear went through in 1966 had a Confederate monument. All of that was, I was just filing that away. And then within the last 10 or 15 years, a childhood friend of mine helped me track down the textbooks that we had studied. And when I read the textbooks, that's when it clicked that I had been dreadfully deceived. And soon after that, I was talking about those textbooks at a library convention in Atlanta. And a woman came up to me afterwards and said, I had been a teacher in Virginia previously, and I taught that same fourth grade textbook you showed on the screen. And I was so glad she talked to me because I had been taught in the fourth grade by an African American teacher. It was the first year our schools were integrated. And here was another Black woman who had also taught from that book. And I asked her the question that I'd wished I could ask my old teacher, which is, what did it feel like to teach that history? And she was so confused by my question, and her answer told me everything because she said, we thought it was all true.
Mhm.
And that's when I realized that this web of deceit was much bigger than just fooling children. It had deceived an entire population, and I knew I needed to write a book. So that's a long answer, but that it truly has been a lifetime journey to gain the insights I needed to know that I was uniquely situated to write this book and that it needed to be written.
You said it was a long answer, but thank you so much for that because this podcast, it's titled Moving Forward, and you you took your mind back into the childhood, but then moved forward to, write this book and, the culture, the identity, everything that you probably grabbed onto again as you were dismantling what you were seeing and finding and hearing. So I appreciate that. And I'm sure the listeners do too. And in your book, The White Lies, it's structured around 20 specific lies. But could you share one or two that you think have been most damaging, and why do you feel that way?
Sure. Um, I'll, I'll give two examples because I think one of the things that's important to understand about the lost cause is that this was a mindset of deception that deliberately evolved after the Civil War. Um, it was motivated and fueled by the needs of the white elite who had been defeated in the Civil War and whose place in society was really being challenged. And they began to construct a distortion of what slavery had been like, what the Civil War had been like, what the reasons had been for fighting the Civil War, as a way to um, recalibrate their entry back into power. And the important thing to realize is that this this practice of fabricating a reality didn't just didn't just occur in this one period. It has been continued through to the present day when we need to, when there is this feeling within certain populations that they need to lie, basically, in order to maintain the upper hand. So I'll give two examples, and one is from that early period, which was spread during and after Reconstruction, and which changed our understanding of the nature of Reconstruction for at least a century. And your listeners will recall that Reconstruction was the period that followed the Civil War. It was the idea that the northern states that had remained allied with the United States of America, that the United States government could impose certain terms and conditions on the South as they went through the reunification process of the states that had seceded. And Reconstruction temporarily stripped that white elite class, former Confederate officers, et cetera, from holding office. It created voting rights for Black men that were equal to those of white men at the time. And it created lanes of advancement for people, Black and white, to enter into politics and government that wouldn't have had those opportunities before. And not until the 70s did historians begin, with one exception that I write about in the book, so let me rephrase that. Not until the 1970s did the community of historians begin to acknowledge that the representation of that history had been um, deliberately distorted to make up down and down up, and suggest that all of that, the multiracial society that was forming after the Civil War and that thrived for the better part of a decade, had been a failure, that it had been rife with corruption, that the Blacks who held office had been inadequate to the task, et cetera, unprepared. And that's not actually borne out by the historical record. But, and this is, you'd have to go through the book. There's a whole chapter on how historians help to spread this misrepresentation of the past by not looking at the full historical record. An oversight that W.B. Du Bois pointed out in 1935, but he was largely ignored as a Black historian. And so by robbing us of that understanding that we are capable in the United States of America of having a multiracial society, that we were creating one after the Civil War, that this is within our abilities. It was more than 100 years ago. It is again today. But by continuing to spread this misconception, which some people still believe, because some people are my age and they didn't go down the path I took. So they read the same textbooks I read or comparable ones in other states in the South and beyond. And that's their understanding of what Reconstruction was like. So that's one example of a white lie. The other one I won't go into in as great a detail, but it's one that has sprung up more recently, which is being used to try to prevent the removal of Confederate communication, using the phrase that we're erasing history when we remove Confederate commemoration. And the short answer is what we're actually removing is propaganda that was put up to reinforce the earlier lies and the Jim Crow white rule that was evolving in the South.
You know, there's a common myth in the Civil War that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but about states' rights. Why does that lie persist, and how do we confront it today?
Right. So that's one of the lies I call out in my book.
Mhm.
And it's essential for us to understand the extent to which the role that slavery played in sparking secession, and then the fight that followed, that's paramount. That is what was behind it all. And to refer to it as states' rights is disingenuous, because the right that the states were fighting for was the right to keep people enslaved. And this was a right that was enshrined in the Confederate Constitution, and um, and a right which advocates for the Confederacy spoke of openly within their states, and when they were visiting other states in the South, when they were trying to convince their leaders to also join the Confederacy.
Hmm. You talked about the Confederate monuments and obviously a lot about the textbooks, and that is definitely a debate. Once again, it's at the center of our national headlines. But how do the battles that we're having, or these battles, reflect deeper questions about culture and identity in America?
Well, one of the things I came to realize, and I spent a long time, not just my personal journey, coming to the decision that I needed to research this book and write it, but I spent longer doing the actual work of creating the book than I've spent on any other project. It was a good 5-year project. And I had wanted to dig as deeply as I could and needed to make sure I was presenting things accurately because I was writing a book about how we've often been misled about the past. And one of the things that came through to me, and sadly, I think we were, as a nation, making a lot of headway, talk about moving forward, trying to come to terms with the fact that um, slavery was an essential part of the founding of the United States, and even its existence beforehand. The 1619 Project helped to make that clear, and people looked with fresh eyes at that through line of slavery through our economy, our morality, etc. But also that underpinning slavery, but other aspects of our life too, have been levels of racism, whether it's been conscious or not, that has that have created impediments in our effort as a country to continue to move forward. And so I think that is one of the things that currently I think is continuing to be a stumbling block. We are having, or some segments of our population are coming to terms with that more naturally than others. And the reaction that people are having who don't want to acknowledge that is not unlike the kind of lying and fabricating that was done through the lost cause.
As I'm sitting here and listening to you, and I'm thinking of the youth, because that's I was a teacher, a principal, and youth are so in my mind all the time. And I obviously worry, because us adults is I appreciate all the research and everything you did on this, because our what we're doing is for the youth. I feel, because that's who we have to bring forward now, moving forward, so they can eventually, take over, or so, lead this country. But what do you think, though, when I think of the youth, what do you think happens to young people when their education is shaped by myths rather than the historical truth?
Well, I can certainly speak to that from an individual perspective
Mhm.
because that was my experience. And, thinking back on it, I think about how passages in my textbooks made it difficult for me to appreciate the challenges that had been faced by my Black peers with whom I started school together. We began sharing school the same year, fourth grade, when we were reading this same history.
Mm.
And so, I mean, I can read a passage or two to you from those books if that would be instructive, and it helps to give a sense of what of how the mindset of a child can be curtailed, contained, restrained from thinking as fully as it should. So when you're told, I mean, for example, there was a line in my fourth grade textbook that shortly before the Civil War, by this time, many people knew that slavery was wrong, but the planters did not know how they could free their slaves and keep their plantations going.
Mm.
And it's got this little beguiling logic to it, but which is like, well, so, oh, well, we're just going to keep slavery going because obviously we have to keep the plantations going, and we didn't know how we could do it otherwise. And so we kept going. And then there are passages that talk about how benevolent this slavery was and how the enslavers were so kind to the people they enslaved and cared for them in sickness and in health. And my seventh grade book talks about how this made plantation life happy and prosperous for everyone. And so if you're thinking about that and you're white, you're thinking, okay, well, this is pretty easy. We just move on now. But also for my peers who were Black and reading that, they're robbed of their understanding of what the experience was like for their ancestors too, if they were enslaved. And we're having our history stolen from us by lying about it, by only telling pieces of the story, or by distorting the parts that are shared. And so when the child is not given permission to use their thinking to evaluate this, well, now how do I think about slavery, knowing that here we are in, 20th or 21st century America, and our economy hasn't collapsed, and we're still a nation. Why was it that we had such a hard time letting go of slavery? You're robbed of being able to ask any of those questions and to have the growth that comes with that. I think that's one answer I would have. You're just diminishing our ability to perceive the world with greater insight.
You have been in your life journey, been in different communities. And as you've been in all these different communities, do you see examples where communities have been successfully moved toward healing by telling a fuller truth about history?
Well, I think in there has been, and maybe it's not always forward, but over time, greater um, greater maturity and how we look at history. Uh, Virtually anywhere I've gone in the country. I'm just back from a trip to Louisiana where I was talking about this book. And I it was the same area where my mother and grandmother had grown up. So it's an area I was familiar with as a child. And there were aspects um of life there that were um completely emblematic of moving forward. The ease with which people were willing to discuss the concepts in the book. There was not great animosity. There was openness and awareness already that this had been going on. So and that's a Southern example, but um, Northern states were not without their racism either. And yet, in places where I've lived or visited in the North or in the West, there is we're making progress. We're not there yet. We have more to do. And I think by exposing this tendency to revert to lies and the feeling that there's something wrong with us if we can't admit we've made mistakes, that's a human trait. But we also know as humans that that's how we grow too. And I'm hopeful that the country will continue to do that just as we individually try to.
Yeah, what I'm pulling out from your responses too is encouraging that voice. And for the youth especially, that don't be afraid to talk, don't be afraid to research
Mhm.
and use your voice. So, but the lost cause narrative lasted more than a century. But what gives you hope that this next generation will see it through?
So, again, I've begun to speak about this history with young people, high school students, college students, and there's the same eagerness to learn that I remember from my high school and college days. Um, the same questioning that goes on and that went on, certainly went on in the 60s and 70s, of the establishment and what what parts of the past to repeat and what parts to improve upon. I think that's a human instinct also. And I think there is more, I think it's harder for lies like this to endure when you have a diffuse media system, and there are just so many more ways for people to collect their information. When I was a child in Lexington, Virginia, there were my history textbooks and the markers on the monuments, and there wasn't much else.
Mm,
But now there are podcasts like yours. There are networks of young people connecting from school to school or community to community, where the truth can pass like fire through brush also,
mhm.
not just lies.
Yeah. And in the classroom, it's, using multiple resources. And with where we are right now in education, multiple resources are plentiful. So
Absolutely.
I
Yeah,
appreciate you saying that, encouraging the youth, encouraging everybody. Don't just take the one source that's in
right.
front of you. Yeah. So my wonder here though is if a teen or an adult finishes the book, White Lies, and feels unsettled, what's the next step you hope that they'll take with all that discomfort?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, there will be discomfort, but maybe there's also resolve, right?
Mm,
And that I certainly felt that. That's one reason I had the reserves to push through a much longer research and writing process. More drafts than it normally takes, because it was so difficult to try to share a book that was about facts and lies, and have it be clear. And so again, there we are connected in so many different ways, and young people are already joining protests. That's one avenue. I am still a believer in contacting your elected representatives. Absolutely research and vote wisely. So that's also something that you can do. And spreading the word, speaking with adults that you know in your schools or in your families or whatever, and helping to question what did you know about this? So here's what I'm reading, and start some dialogues and engage in ways that help to maybe heal all of us a little bit.
yeah. Well, and I'm hoping, and I know the listeners are hearing, like I'm hearing, is you've moved forward through so many phases, journeys of your life, and you've written many books that uncover overlooked history. But how has writing White Lies, a book that's really rooted in your own childhood experience, how has it changed you both as a historian and as a person? Like you've moved forward, such a great thing that you've gone through in life. How has it changed you though
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I guess um, I suspect I haven't learned all the ways it's changed me because, for example, making that trip to Louisiana and feeling welcomed in a part of the country where I wasn't sure how I would be received, um, that gave me a lot of hope, and that made me feel um, uh, like the effort that I had put into it was bearing fruit. Now, did I have roses strewn in my path? No. Did I have people question or want to debate points with me? Absolutely. And I expected that, and I appreciated that they had the courage to speak up and that we were able to engage civilly in doing that. But I think another, and so personally, that was important. Reconnecting with my hometown, Lexington, Virginia, where I grew up. I'd been born in Tennessee, but raised in Lexington. Um, was also heartening, and seeing how much that community has moved on. A lot of the monuments that were seemed fixed for eternity have been moved or changed or recontextualized. There's been a lot of growth in that community. Again, um, I felt welcome to look at this history from within my old hometown, where there'd been an entirely different vibe, 40
Mhm.
years, 50 years earlier. And so that was personally very healing, really, because I had in the last 15, 20, maybe even longer years, come away feeling kind of betrayed by that childhood. And this allowed that to come full circle. And as a writer, Well, anytime you survive a test, whether it's a short duration or long, I learned so much from writing this book. I feel a sense of satisfaction with how it turned out, and it definitely has given me the courage to continue to push forward, um, and to pace myself and continue to look at history in a questioning way.
Mm. I'm going to pull out two words you just said, pace myself. That's something I just really need to put into myself also moving forward as we continue moving forward through our life journey. And I cannot thank you enough for your honesty, your research, your courage in writing White Lies by pulling apart the myths of the lost cause. You've given us ways to confront the falsehoods that have shaped our past and to begin imagining a future built on truth. To my listeners, I encourage you to read White Lies, How the South Lost the Civil War, Then Rewrote History. Whether you're a teen or an adult, it's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how history has been written and rewritten in America. Until next time, let's keep moving forward, grounded in truth and committed to healing and hope. Thank you, Ann, so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.